Good morning, everyone. My name is Rich Sloma. Welcome to today's New York State Archives presentation of how to process and purge inactive records. Today's presenters are Arthur Siegel and Sarah Durling. The session is being recorded and will be available for future viewing. If you have any questions, please type them in the chat box to the right side of your screen and we will answer them at the end of the presentation. And now I will turn the presentation over to Arthur. Oh, and I'm not sure if you know Arthur, you're muted.
Sorry. Thanks, Rich. As Rich just stated, I'm Arthur, and today Sarah and I are going to tell you how to process and purge your inactive records and why doing so is so important to maintaining a functional records management program. The session will last an hour, give or take, depending on how many questions we receive from you and how complex they are. As Rich said, the session is being recorded, so no need to frantically write down everything we say. If you're attending live, you'll receive an email once the session is available for online viewing. People watching live should have received a workbook showing all the slides. If you're watching a recording of this session and want copies of the slides, please contact archive staff at arctrain@nyscd.gov. If you have questions, please enter them into the chat box when they occur to you. We'll answer them at the end of the presentation. Watching a recording or think of a question after the live session, we'll provide you with contact information for State Archive staff at the end of the presentation. And with that, here we go. So what does it mean to process and purge inactive records? Before we answer that, let's just make sure everyone is clear about what an inactive record is. Records have two basic stages in their life cycle, an active phase and an inactive one. The active phase is when records are regularly used by staff in the normal course of their business. Records become inactive when they're no longer used frequently or at all. So, for example, a contract becomes inactive when the contract work is completed and the final payment is made. Similarly, a personnel file becomes inactive when the employee separates from the agency or local government. So again, what does it mean to process and purge inactive records? Well, it means taking certain steps. One, reviewing your active records in filing cabinets or other office spaces and identifying those that are inactive. Inactive records should be boxed and labeled and transferred to an inactive storage area. Another step is identifying inactive records that might be obsolete, and then disposing of those obsolete records and documenting their destruction. It's usually a good idea to document exactly what you're getting rid of and the date on which they were tossed. Another step is identifying and preserving permanent records. This is usually a small percentage of all the records that you may have. And maintaining access to all inactive records throughout their life cycle by creating a list of box contents and identifying their location in the inactive records room. Now, this may sound like a ton of work, but it's definitely doable. Still, in order to better complete these steps, it would be helpful to schedule when this process will occur. Depending on the needs of your government or state agency, you may do this regularly as needed or, more likely, on a schedule, say like once or twice a year, but certainly no less than once a year. If you and your staff don't have the time to do this at least once a year, you really should hire someone to assist you with this vital process. Also, enlist the help of all departments or offices in your organization with this endeavor. This is a team effort, and it's important that everyone get involved. Remember, transferring records from your office to inactive storage, managing inactive records, and disposing of obsolete records constitute an essential foundation of records management. But let's take these step by step. The first step, as I mentioned, is identifying inactive records, separating them from their active counterparts and transferring them to a separate storage location. This will free up valuable office space for records that are more frequently used. When planning to transfer your records from your active office space to your inactive records area, you need to do a few things. First, evaluate your office files for infrequency of use. As records managers, or individuals working with a specific set of records, you would need to look at what records are being utilized frequently, in other words, active records, and separate them from those that are not. And talk to those individuals who either create the records or who routinely use the records to help you determine if they are inactive. Your retention schedule can also help you do this. For local governments, it's the LGS-1. For state agencies, it's either the State General Schedule or agency-specific schedules. We'll talk a little more about these later on. Establish a transfer procedure for your inactive records. Determine who will box and label the records, who will move the records, and where they will be moved to. Determine if you need to fill out a transfer sheet and how often you should transfer the records. Local government records will typically be moved to an off-site storage facility or perhaps a storage space located in another part of the building in which active records are maintained. State agency inactive records can be maintained on-site, though we do encourage their transfer to the State Records Center, where they can be managed and eventually disposed of for a small fee by State Archives staff. Agencies can find more information about State Records Center services on our website. Finally, document the movement of your records with a transfer form so everyone is aware of what records were moved, when they were moved, and who is currently responsible for them. Once you've reviewed your records and identified the inactive ones, you'll need a place to store them. Another purpose of this webinar is to help you understand the importance of creating a clean, safe, and organized space for your inactive records to be stored. So, before you begin, you need to make sure that the space that you're storing your records in is free from non-records, such as magazines or non-governmental publications, sources of heat and fire, chemicals, surplus equipment, and things like holiday supplies, food, used furniture, and other extraneous items. We know that circumstances will vary, and most agencies or local governments won't have a perfect and active storage area. But what's important is that you have room to work or a staging area, as well as a clean space to store your records. So earlier I referenced using a transfer form to document the movement of records to a storage facility. But what information do you need on a transfer form? Content may differ whether you're the sole user of storage space or sharing it with other entities. Here's an example from the town of Whittier. At the top, staff identify which town department owns the records and the date on which the records were transferred. It usually makes sense to number the boxes on each list. Because all your record storage boxes probably look alike, it's often a good idea to go a step further and give each box a unique identifying number to make them easier to identify. You're also going to want to describe the records. The record series title might be sufficient, though it often makes sense to add additional information so that staff can easily identify the one box they need rather than the 20 boxes that might contain what they're looking for. You should also include the year that the records were created and the record series number associated with it. These are your keys to verifying that the correct disposition date was selected. It may be useful to include the retention period and disposition date here too, so that all necessary information about retention requirements are in one place. If you use multiple types of boxes or don't always fill them completely, you might want to include the total records volume in cubic feet. This can be useful information when compiling statistics or locating a specific box. Once you've described the boxes and their contents, you need to document that the transfer has been authorized by the appropriate staff. At the bottom of the sample form, you can see spaces for the signatures of the head of the department that owns the records and the records management person who received the records. Titles are listed to document that the signing individual was authorized to make the transfer, while dates show when the authorization took place and document when the records changed custody. As I noted earlier, while state agencies can use their own space to store inactive records and thus can use the previous form as a template, they also have access to the State Records Center to store their inactive records. Here's a sample transfer list form, aka the Rec 1, that agencies use if they wish to transfer their inactive files to the State Records Center. Because we operate and manage the Records Center independently to serve many state agencies, we require some additional information toward the top of the form about the agency or program unit and approval of the state agency RMO, or Records Management Officer. Also, we generate box barcode labels and mail them to agencies in advance of them transferring records. Thus, the first column documents the barcode number, and the second column is used for the transfer list box number. This is followed by a description of records, whether records are ultimately archival and should be transferred to the state archives, disposition information in month and year, and finally, the state general schedule item or agency-specific item that authorizes disposition. Due to the size and complexity of state government, we review transfer lists submitted by agencies before transfer of their records to ensure that disposition information matches with the proposed schedule item. And now I'm going to turn it over to Sarah.
Thanks, Arthur. So once you've decided what needs to be kept and for how long, you'll hopefully have a whole bunch of documents that you are no longer needed and can be gotten rid of. Hooray! But do you know which records these are? And how do you make sure that they're being disposed of properly? The very first thing that you're going to want to do is verify the minimum period of time that the records need to be kept. Next, you're going to separate the records that can be destroyed from those that require additional retention. Now, when destroying those records, you're going to want to consider which method makes the most sense. And it's good practice to document what was destroyed, when, and who authorized that destruction. So, getting to my favorite topic. What is a retention schedule? So, different records need to be kept for different lengths of time and for different reasons. Some are actually mentioned in laws or regs with clearly spelled out statements like this type of information must be retained for at least X number of years. Other record types should be retained long enough that they're available if you're audited or if they become involved in a lawsuit. But most record types need to be kept for a certain length of time to meet administrative needs. In order to save every state agency and local government from having to do research on how long each type of documentation needs to be kept, the state archives creates a retention schedule which spells out, based on our research, the minimum amount of time that various record types need to be retained. Retention schedules describe records by function and content rather than format, and that's important. A single record series likely describes records in multiple formats. They could be paper, electronic, microfilm. The same retention period applies to all records under a specific series, regardless of the format in which they're saved. Though if you have copies in multiple formats, you may want to identify one as your official copy and retain that copy for the duration of the retention period. So, as I've mentioned, the time period listed within a record series is the minimum amount of time that you need to keep given content. There is no requirement that you get rid of records after that listed retention period, and in some cases, the listed retention period may not be long enough to meet your needs. You should document your in-office requirements for future reference for yourself, your colleagues, and if necessary, auditors in the courts to demonstrate that this is a policy and going to be maintained consistently. The content within the schedule is really pretty limited though. So it tells you how long to keep things, but not stuff like how to go about destroying them when they're no longer needed, or whether certain record types contain personal private information, critical infrastructure details, or other content that's protected from disclosure. Staff may need to look closely at records before selecting the best method of destruction, and when in doubt, consult an attorney who works with the unit or owns the records. The Committee for Open Government is also a great resource when determining which record types are protected from disclosure. Another important point to consider is just because a record type is listed within a schedule does not mean that you need to create it. All it tells you is how long you have to keep those records if you do have them. And for my local governments out there that do not have an airport, do you really want to have to create an airport? Because there are airport items in the retention schedule. I can see a lot of you shaking your heads in horror, right? It also doesn't tell you what to do with non-records like blank forms and third-party publications. Why is this a big deal? So we like to say that the main benefit of records management is that it helps you find what you need quickly so you can get back to doing your job. Following a retention schedule means that you know that the record that you need still exists because it hasn't met the minimum retention requirement yet. This not only helps you fulfill your administrative needs, but it helps keep you out of hot water when there's a FOIL request, or an audit, or a lawsuit. They also help you identify records that need to be kept permanently or for a long time so you can plan how to make sure to remain there accessible, which can be really important when you're dealing with electronic records. Regularly discarding records in accordance with retention schedules helps avoid the needle in a haystack issue. You no longer have to search through all kinds of no longer useful content when you're looking for a document. Tossing what you no longer need in compliance with retention schedules also means that you don't need to pull, review, reproduce, redact, or provide access to it when you receive a FOIL request or there's an audit or a lawsuit. Retrieval can also be more accurate because you don't have to go through a bunch of similar documents and outdated versions to find what you need. How many of you out there have spent an untold amount of time in a dark, damp, dusty storage area, sifting through boxes of records that you potentially could have gotten rid of just to find one record, and it took you an hour, 3 hours, a week? Office and file room space are expensive, as is storage equipment, whether physical or electronic. The less stuff you keep, the less you have to pay to store it. Keeping all of what you need and none of what you don't can also save a ton of money when responding to litigation, audits, and FOIL requests, and can even save you from significant fees and penalties. And finally, following retention schedules just makes your life easier, and as a result may have a positive impact on staff morale, and we all know when it comes to records management, we need to keep that up. So I said that the State Archives creates retention schedules so that you don't have to, but what are they? Well, if you're with a local government, you use the Retention and Disposition Schedule for New York local government records, which we generally refer to as the LGS-1. If you're a state agency, there are two resources for you to check. The General Retention and Disposition Schedule for New York State government records, which is known to all of us as the General Schedule, and it describes record types that every agency commonly creates in the course of business. For retention information about records that are specific to your mission, however, state agency staff should consult the relevant state agency specific retention schedules. If you have questions about the schedules and how to use them, your first stop should be your records management officer or other records management staff within your organization. They may be able to provide you with an office retention schedule, for example, that just lists the records that your office is going to be in charge of managing and uses familiar terminology, but should be able to help you out generally. Your second stop is also the State Archives. State Archive staffs are available to help interpret schedules and, when necessary, create new ones or amend those that are already in existence. So you've reviewed your records, you've compared them against the retention schedules, you've determined that there is stuff that you can get rid of. Hooray! How do you actually go about doing that? Well, there are multiple methods of destruction you can choose from. It's really rare for there to be any one legally appropriate way to get rid of a specific record type. Most records are not confidential and can go straight into the recycling bin, but with no tearing or shredding required. But sometimes that's not always true. Um, If there are specific requirements based on format, certain records like canceled obligations have specific destruction requirements that are spelled out in the state law, which, if you need the reference, is Local Finance Law, Section 63.10. Records that are stored on microfilm can be pulverized or shredded or even recycled for the silver. When you're dealing with your electronic records, you can't just hit the delete button and call it good. It's not that simple. You do want to work with your IT staff to make sure that you are appropriately destroying your electronic records and that they are completely destroyed. When dealing with confidential records, such as student records or personnel records, make sure that they are totally destroyed. If the records contain personal private information or other protected content, you're probably going to want to shred them. In some cases, you may even want to get one of those super fancy shredders that turns everything into confetti. Bonded recycling is always a good option because you can demonstrate that they were destroyed securely. Depending on where you are, burning may be an option. And I know that there are some folks out there who are really enthusiastic about that, but it's not necessarily allowed in all areas and it may not be as effective as shredding. And I I have to stress this, burying records in a landfill is not a safe manner of destruction for protected information. Basically, think about whether or not you want to end up on the nightly news in a not so flattering light when you destroy your records. If they're found and information on them is critical and valuable, it might lead to the loss of public trust and other issues for your government and organization. While you're not legally required to document what was destroyed and when, it's a really good idea. We strongly recommend it. Having a way to confirm whether a document has been destroyed means that you can save time and effort searching for content that no longer exists. Knowing what you no longer have and being able to document that it was destroyed in accordance to the appropriate retention schedule means that you don't have to worry about lawsuits suggesting that you destroyed something inappropriately or didn't provide it in a timely manner because you didn't know that you still had it. Being able to show a history of routine destruction also helps document that records were not destroyed specifically so that you wouldn't have to provide copies in response to FOIL, litigation, or an audit. So here's a sample disposition form. It's very similar to the transfer forms we discussed earlier, but contains a little less information. You can make your own if you like, or we use the sample form posted on the Forms and Tools page of our website. Once you've separated your inactive records from your active records and destroyed the records that have reached their disposition date, what do you do with records that you don't access often, but you can't get rid of quite yet? Well, you can do what our former archive staff member, Kent, shown here, is doing. Find a comfy location and start organizing those records. When organizing records, you want to be kind to your future self and your colleagues' future selves and arrange things so that records are easy to find quickly and easy to dispose of when the retention periods have ended. That means making good choices when it comes to how you group records and in what you store them. Spoiler alert, you're going to probably use boxes. How you label those boxes and how you arrange those boxes and track their locations to ease retrieval or for use or destruction. The last thing that you want to do is fill a box with a mishmash of unrelated records that can't all be destroyed at the same time. To avoid this, limit each box to one record series or one related group of series and one disposition date. Why do you want to do this? Combining multiple record types or disposition dates within a single box makes it so much more difficult to find the box that you need and the content you're looking for inside the box. That means you either need to weed the box periodically and to pull the records that you no longer need, and then you end up with a bunch of partially filled boxes that take up a bunch of space. Weed periodically and shift the contents between boxes to reduce the number of boxes being used, and honestly, that is generally not going to be worth the hassle. Or you end up saving a bunch of content for much longer than is necessary because it happens to be in a box with other records that have a later disposition date, and that wastes space and exposes you to risk. You're also going to want to make sure that each box contains records from only one department. This helps to avoid miscommunications about what needs to happen with the box, inappropriate access to confidential content, or two offices wanting to check out the same box at the same time. When you box things up, you want to be choosy about the materials that you use. You want to use good, sturdy, cubic foot boxes. The state archives staff can provide a link to the ones we prefer. You don't want to use cheap cubic foot boxes that rip when you're putting them together, fall apart when you're moving them from place to place, or collapse when stacked in a pile. Having a handle on a box can give away. Having the handle of a box give away when you're trying to move it is frustrating and also painful for your toes. Larger boxes can get unreasonably heavy when you fill them, and odd-shaped boxes make it more likely for documents to slump and curl when they're in storage, which can lead to damage. Also, you don't want to use them because they're going to not they're going to affect the amount of space that you have available for your boxes on your shelves. Standardized boxes allow you to do better planning. Irregularly sized boxes can cause problems in that regard. And I know printer boxes are really tempting because they're everywhere, right? Printer paper boxes are like super, super handy, but they're not what you want to store your records in. You want to get proper records boxes. When filling boxes, do not just move hanging folders from the filing cabinet to the box. There are 3 good reasons for that, and honestly, there's probably a bunch more. That you'll make enemies of the folks who have to move the boxes in and out of storage. Let's start with that. The metal hanger bars can be really sneaky and can cut or otherwise hurt your fingers as you're moving boxes from place to place and on and off of high shelves. They will damage and weaken your nice records boxes over time, making them more likely to fail. They will damage the upper edge of the box and rip them apart. And they'll waste space within the boxes. Do you really want to pay for storing hanging file folders if you're paying for storage? When reasonable, you also want to remove records from binders because they're another way to waste space and add weight to the boxes. So, we're all in agreement. We're all going to limit the box to records and only records. It's awesome, right? You still need to be careful not to overpack the boxes. Shoving records in and out of those boxes is a great way to rip or crumble them, and you want to make sure you have enough room so you can easily remove and return content. This becomes especially important if the box is stored in a humid location or it gets wet. Monica, one of our advisory officers, has a story where she was responding to a flood situation in a records room, and the boxes were so tightly packed and had absorbed enough water that the only way to get the records out was to peel the box open like a banana peel. You're going to want to avoid folding records, especially those that are being kept permanently or for a very long time. They take up more space, become brittle at the fold point, and cost a whole lot to unfold if you eventually have to bring it to a conservator to do it for you. The thing about records boxes is they all kind of look alike, and you're going to want to label them well. The labels should all look alike and be in the same place on each box so that you're able to quickly locate and review them. You can pre-print the labels, which saves time. It also makes it easy for the unit staff who are packing the boxes and compiling the box inventories to label the box before it's sent to records management staff for storage. You can go with a simple, unique box number or provide more detail like a record series name, record date, the disposition date. You want to make sure, though, that enough information is written on the box itself that should your record storage space get humid or your boxes get wet, either of which can cause label sticker failure, you'll still be able to identify the box. Even if you're writing information on the box, you're still going to want to invest in labels that are unlikely to fall off, and that means good adhesive on those labels. Self-adhesive, especially foiled back, tend to be the best. Gummed labels tend to fall off. You may also tape the label to the box, but make sure when you're taping that if you're using scannable barcodes on your boxes, and some governments do, um, that you're not taping over those barcodes because that can mess with the scanner. If you want to save boxes and be super fancy, you can buy plastic sleeves that hold labels and affix them to your boxes and just slide labels in and out as you're replacing them, which is kind of nifty. Arrangement is another technical word that means something pretty simple. In this case, it means thinking ahead and putting boxes in storage locations such that you can find them again. This might mean putting all boxes belonging to a specific record series or department together or storing them sequentially by box number or year. This may not be the best method. It isn't always. Um, so for example, what if some records types grow in volume very quickly and others grow very slowly? Do you leave lots of empty room on your shelves so that one set can grow? What do you do if you start running out of space for one group of records? I mean, do you steal room for another group? Or what if boxes don't come to the record storage area on a regular, predictable basis? And we all know we've got that one office that we don't hear from for months and months or even years on end. And then suddenly there is a whole pallet of records sitting in our doorway that we need to find somewhere to put them. When things like this happen, do you need to rearrange everything if new boxes come in that fall part way through your organizational scheme and you don't have a lot of empty spaces available? Shifting 50 boxes to make room for 2 surprise additions can feel like a huge waste of time. And what if you want your records boxes to have a level of anonymity? The great thing about all records boxes looking like is that it's impossible to tell at a glance which boxes contain protected information unless you've labeled them in such a way that it's visible. It's generally easier to shelve boxes wherever there's room and track their location using a database, a spreadsheet, a log, whatever works best for you. If you use one of these systems, it's incredibly easy to record that, say, box 16201, which contains payroll records from 2021 for employees with last names starting with NA through NE, is in row D on shelving unit number 15 in spot 3 on shelf 4. With that information, you can head to the right location and pick up the correct box without even having to look at any of the surrounding boxes. This can dramatically reduce the amount of time needed to retrieve records. If you go a step further and use the system to track box disposition dates, you can create a monthly printout of which boxes are eligible for destruction, which can be shared with the owning units, and after they're receiving their approval, can be used to pull and dispose of those boxes. Yes, more destruction. The tools that you use don't have to be complex or expensive. Depending on how many boxes you have, you might be able to use just, a simple log or spreadsheet that meets your needs, particularly if you're a smaller government. You don't also need to start from the ground up. The sample records management database applications are available through the state archives. Just reach out to your records advisory officer or one of the folks in state agency services, and we're happy to help you out with that information. Commercial records management software is also an option, although you really should consider whether or not the more sophisticated functions they offer is worth the cost to you and managing those records. Whether you pick box locations by unit or type or randomize them based on space availability, you may want to strategize how things are laid out. For example, it may be a good idea to reserve areas under pipes that might leak for the records whose unintentional early damage would be least traumatizing. The same applies to lower shelves in areas where there's more likely to be flooding problems. So, translation on that is don't put your permanent records on bottom shelves if you're in a situation where there may be a flood. Don't put your your personnel records immediately under water pipes that might leak. Put things that are going to be less valuable, like receipts that you need to hold on to for 6 years, in those locations because it's going to be less damaging if they're lost. And now I'm going to hand this back to Arthur, who is going to talk about additional considerations.
Thanks, Sarah. Okay, so we've talked quite a bit today about some of the technical aspects of records management, and it's probably a lot to take in. But before we go, we'd like to offer just a few more things to consider in order to make your job easier and to smooth out the bumps along your journey. Once records are stored in the inactive storage area, there may be times when you, as a state agency or local government, require access to the records stored there. The following are some methods that can track records, individual boxes, or whole rows or units, and can be tied to a database for inventory control. For those of you that are old school, there's the out card, a low-tech and low-cost way of tracking and identifying what records have been removed, who currently has them, and when they were removed and returned. It's a physical card that's usually put in the place where a record was originally stored. However, if staff forget to use the card properly, there's the risk that records could go unaccounted for or even be misfiled. There's also the sign-out log, which is also a low-tech method of tracking records. The log can be hard copy or an electronic document and can be located in the record storage area or on a centralized drive that you can have access to. However, this could be subject to data entry errors, which could also lead to missing or misfiled records. For something a little more sophisticated, there's barcoding, with labels placed on individual boxes. This greatly reduces data entry errors, the potential for that, controls circulation, and allows for quicker shelf reading, and is also most useful when records are stored in large or multiple locations, such as Sarah was describing about putting your boxes just wherever there's open space. A barcoding system usually includes labels, scanning wand, portable data collection device, cable interface, and software to upload data to the database. It's generally inexpensive to set up and run, though it's more labor intensive, requiring direct scanning or individual boxes. Finally, there's radio frequency ID, an emerging technology that's demonstrated potential in records management. This transmits a radio signal between a tag and a reader. The tag contains a chip that can store very detailed information, such as the name of the agency, local government, or unit that created the record, the contents of the box, and the location of the box. Unlike barcoding, there's no need for direct scanning, as whole rows can be read at once, but it is more expensive to set up and run. Readers can cost up to $3,000, while tags can be 50 cents to $1 per tag. There are also some limitations in transmission distances, and certain materials can even block the signal. Another thing to consider is that permanent or archival records need special treatment and attention. So when identifying and preserving those records that are permanent, you want to try to separate them from those that have a disposition date. There are several reasons for doing this. For one thing, it limits the movement of these records. The less handling, the better. It also prevents them from being destroyed accidentally. When you have a lot of records in storage, even with the best tracking systems, accidents can happen. And it allows you to design a storage area to ensure that these records can be properly preserved long term. For instance, storage areas that may have better security or environmental controls. When working with permanent records, you may want to purchase acid-free folders or boxes to ensure that physical degradation of the records can be minimized over long periods. You should also be aware that when you're storing records long-term or permanently, you may want to purchase special equipment designed for specialty records, such as map cabinets for your oversized maps and drawings. I should point out here that not all these considerations are pertinent to state agencies, since unlike local governments, state agencies should ultimately transfer permanent records to the state archives, located in the Cultural Education Center in downtown Albany. So, what does it take to make this process happen? Well, as records managers, there are several things you need to do. First, set aside specific times. As we stated earlier, you need to designate a time frame at least once a year when this process can happen. In some cases, depending on the volume of records and number of staff members, you may want to do this several times a year. In fact, it's a good idea to designate a specific records day when the entire agency or local government can get together and identify, box up, label, and write the transfer sheets needed to move their records from the active areas to the inactive storage room. Also, you can delegate duties. As records managers, you'll also be responsible for working with the departments in assigning tasks and training them on their responsibilities for that day or for the long term as it relates to their records. If you're not sure how to organize and process your records, you may want to consider hiring a records specialist to guide and oversee the process and ensure that it's done properly. You may ultimately decide you'll need to use a combination of the above approaches or do something different. This isn't particularly unusual. Just do what you need to do in order to accomplish the task. And finally, if you're still unsure, please feel free to contact us at the State Archives for additional help. It's also important to develop a policies and procedures manual or ensure that it's up to date if you already have one in place. When it comes to developing policies and procedures, most people find this a daunting task, but it's not as difficult as you may think because most people already have some sort of policies and procedures in place. They just need to put them in writing. Note that there are numerous benefits to establishing and documenting your policies and procedures. For one thing, it promotes program permanence. Developing records management policies and procedures and putting them in writing ensures that your successors will have a program to follow. It also reinforces uniform practices by establishing and codifying a set of rules, making it easier for staff to follow. Doing so makes staff turnover and transitions easier also and less disruptive to your organization. Indeed, it aids in staff training by assisting new staff in learning how the program functions and reinforcing methods and procedures for new and established staff. A manual documents procedures and thus is especially important for e-discovery issues or legal challenges. It also establishes responsibilities stating who's supposed to do what functions and establishing associated authority. Now, a policy and procedures manual might include sections on such things as transferring records to storage, who's authorized to access confidential records or retrieve records, the disposition of records, like when and how records should be destroyed, how historical or permanent records are to be cared for, reporting mechanisms, program review, and staff responsibilities. Finally, it's important to distribute the manuals so that all staff have access to it and are aware of the policies, particularly in the storage facility. For additional help in developing a manual, you can go to our website or contact us at the State Archives. Well, we hope this webinar has been beneficial in helping you with the process of managing and purging your inactive records. Additional details on many of the topics we discussed today can be found on our website, including publications that are free to access. You can also attend State Archives workshops and webinars like this one on some more specific topics. See our website and for a list and a schedule of those webinars. For local governments, contact your records advisory officer for a visit to provide direct advice based on on-site review of current storage conditions and to help you prepare a grant application for inactive records. State agencies can contact the State Agency Services Unit for advice. You can network with others who've set up and maintained an inactive records program and learn from their experience. Records management associations such as ARMA and NIALGRO can provide excellent network opportunities. Organizations like the Association of Towns, New York State Town Clerks Association, New York Conference of Mayors, and others like those can provide excellent contacts as well. Finally, you can join records management associations and listservs. They can be a support as you're starting out. And finally, here is some contact information for scheduling a state agency services, as well as for the various records advisory officers that we have. So feel free to call or email us if you need any assistance. So thank you for attending. And now if there are any questions, we can take those.
Yes, Arthur and Sarah, we have several questions here. I'm going to go ahead and start from an early question we had early on in this webinar from Jamie. Do you have a sample to provide of the transfer form? So a sample transfer form.
Sure, Jamie. If you check out the Farms and Tools page, we have examples of container list templates, transfer lists, a couple of different things that you might be able to use to use as models for developing your own.
Okay. And let's see here. We have a question from Richard. I know this question is very specific, but is there a rule in the LGS that can be applied to flexible spending account enrollment forms?
I am going to recommend that you reach out to your records advisory officer with that question so that they can help you find it.
And in anticipation of that, excuse me for getting tripped up, Sarah, I did note that Richard is with BOCES.
Oh, so you're one of my folks.
Yep, so he would contact Sarah. Okay. Um, Agnes asks, if something is not a city record or the original record, can they just be thrown away, or do those need to go on a disposition schedule?
It depends. So a record is any information created or received. So if it wasn't created by the city but was received by the city in the course of business, that still could potentially be a record. So it's really going to depend on what it is.
Okay, we have a question from Tamara. I understand that court records are to be handled differently and must go through state approval. Are the town clerks responsible for the disposal of these records if the court clerks do not or will not deal with their own records?
So hold on, let me find the thing that I'm looking for. For the most part, no, unless they have custody of the records. So, and this is me reading directly from the website, records and dockets of town and village courts are the property of the village or town of the residents of such justice per the Uniform Justice Court Law on section 2019-A. Upon retirement, all village or town justices must file the records in their custody in the office of the clerk of their respective village or town courts. In the case of the abolishment of the village court, the active records must be deposited with the town court to see through the disposition of the case, but the disposed cases remain with the village for the duration of the retention periods. So Unless you have custody of them, no. If you do have custody of them, then you still have to go through courts.
Okay, and have a question from Camille. Is there a best practice method of looking up the retention schedule for a document in the LG one? Once located, what data needs to be referenced in the inventory record?
So, I'm going to recommend for folks who have questions about using the, I mean, I'll talk about it, but for questions about using the retention schedules, we have a couple of webinars that talk about that, that you can access via our website or via our YouTube page that will walk you through using the retention schedules. For the LGS one specifically, I tend to use the keyword search function online, which I find to be fast and accurate. But if you are working with the PDF or the paper version, using the index in the back or a keyword search in the PDF tends to be the most effective way for me to use it. That's not necessarily going to be true of everybody. But there are ways to navigate it fairly quickly. With regard to your inventory, I mean, your inventory, again, we have a whole webinar on that, which and some publications I recommend you take a look at. But you're going to want to include the retention schedule item number, the title, perhaps, and the associated retention period as part of your inventory so that you can, when you can associate it with the date range that you're documenting of the records that you actually have and use that to help determine what needs to be kept and how long it needs to be kept. I hope that makes sense.
Okay, a question from Kate, which she believes may be more of an IT question. I am looking to scan my inactive personnel files via TIFF or PDFA. Is there any guidance on how to protect these records from hacking, as they have sensitive information such as social security numbers? Should they only be scanned to microfilm or flash drive?
So yeah, this is definitely more of an IT question than from us. We're going to always recommend as part of our digital imaging guidelines, which are on our website. And if you're imaging records, I absolutely recommend folks read, especially if you're looking at doing a grant, if you're a local government, because it tells you that we want these records to be stored in a backed up server environment, so that, you know, should something happen to one copy, there's another copy available and you can pull that easily. Um, if you can still totally scan them to microfilm, not as many people are doing that anymore, but it is still a viable option. I would not recommend putting them on a flash drive.
Okay, have a question here from Dawn. I have found the LGS one to be very time consuming by having all types of records management info in one book. I find that I need to flip many pages to find the town code I need. And that kind of goes back to the earlier question, Sarah.
Yeah, I mean, I would recommend taking a look at our webinars on the topic and perhaps working with your records management officer or if you're not the records management officer, to develop office schedules that are only pulling the items from that book, from the LGS one that you need within your departments, and so that you don't have to flip through the entire book. You're just looking at the items that you specifically know are going to be used in the clerk's office or in payroll or in the historian's office, whatever makes the most sense.
Debbie asks, does anyone have a sample policies and procedures manual that they can share?
Um, if folks want to share that with Debbie, that would be awesome. But we also have a couple of sample manuals on our website under Forms and Tools that you can rip apart and recombine and edit to meet your needs.
And I also was going to add to that, Sarah, I included the link in Forms and Tools as well in the chat box. If people want to go, they can click on that page.
Awesome. Thanks,
Uh,
Rich.
Tamara asks, any suggestions for large, thick, folded building plans and maps? Can they be scanned? And would the scanned maps be considered the original, or would we still have to keep the paper copy as the original?
It depends. Yeah, you totally can scan them. Again, make sure that you're following the digital imaging guidelines for that. You can scan any records. I mean, flat out, you can scan any records. Any records that are 1910 and older, you have to keep the paper copy of, but you can still scan them. Anything that's that's 1911 and later, you can potentially, if you're following the imaging guidelines, Establish that the electronic copy is going to be the official copy and dispose of the paper. However, we strongly recommend that you review those records before you do that, determine whether or not there's historic or intrinsic value to the paper records before you get rid of them, particularly for things like maps and plans, because those might have annotations or something that might have value to them.
Okay, we have a question here from Danielle. You mentioned grants for help with getting an effective process started or continued. Where do we go to for grants like that?
All right, so grants. State agencies, I regret to inform you that you are not eligible for our grant program. I am very sorry. I'm very sad about that too. Local governments, there is the Local Government Records Management Improvement Fund grant. We are in our 30-something year at this point. We offer grants to local governments to improve their records management programs. And we are not currently open for applications, probably looking at that sometime this winter for the next year's cycle. But if you go out to our website under grants and look for the Local Government Records Management Improvement Fund, there will be information about that there. Or you can reach out to your records advisory officer, and we're more than happy to talk to you about, especially if you're looking at a project this time, we want to talk to you about that to help you figure out what you want to do.
Okay, let's see, have a question here from Donna. If the county has maps, is it necessary for us to keep them as well?
Yeah, I mean, I would want to keep maps. So I
Okay.
guess it depends.
Eileen asks, what formats are acceptable for digital records? Are TIFF acceptable, or do we need to convert to PDFA?
Okay, so TIFF, uncompressed TIFF and PDFA are both acceptable for converting to digital formats from paper. Our imaging guidelines do talk about that fairly extensively, and also provide details as to what resolution you need to scan in and other important things that you should be aware of with regard to metadata, that sort of thing. When it comes to born digital records, we don't have strict requirements associated with that. But the thing is, you have to maintain records, electronic records, for the duration of their lifespan. And that means you have to be able to open and access the content in them. And for 6-year records, leaving them in whatever format they were created in, probably not a big deal, right? You can probably still access them in 6 years. But when you're starting to talk about long-term lifespans, when you're talking about records that are 20 years old, you're talking about records that are 50 years old, you're talking about records that you have to retain permanently, you want to make sure that you're putting them in formats from the get that are going to be good for them and easy to migrate in and out of as you're migrating those records across platforms and systems for the duration of their lifespan, which means you really, really need to be talking to your IT folks.
Okay, Teresa asks, I am unclear on why one would put permanent records on microfiche if you still must retain the original.
I mean, you don't have to. I'm not saying that you have to. It's an option. Um, it's, but I mean, if it's 1910 and older, you have to retain the original, whether you scan it to electronic or should you choose to turn it to microfilm.
Okay, Jennifer asks, do you have a webinar related to digital imaging guidelines / best practices?
So, good news for you. We're updating that in December. So I would sign up for that right now. Go out to our website, and it is free to, like this one, free to sign up for. And even if you can't attend, sign up for it anyways, because we will send you the link to it once it's available.
Okay, Lauren asks, do you have more specific guidance on what is necessary to retain records which have been destroyed? I guess necessary to retain documentation regarding records which have been destroyed.
Yeah, I mean, there's the sample document on our policies and, sorry, on, come on, words, Sarah, on forms and tools. Arthur, do you have anything you want to add to that?
No, I mean, yeah, just basically keep information on like the series that were destroyed, the just basically inventory type information on what you destroyed, and I think that should be sufficient.
Okay, and finally, it looks like it's our last question, unless we get any more. Jessica asks, is there any reason we should keep an old MU1 schedule, or is it safe to dispose of it?
Um, I would think it's largely safe to dispose of it unless you have annotations in it that you really need to have, because the LGS1 cross-references the old numbers in the schedules so that you can reference those as needed. That said, I would, if you've got legal counsel on hand, I would consult them and see if they think you have any reason you need to hold on to them.
And while we're waiting to see if there are any additional questions, we still have about 5 minutes left. If anybody, I was going to add, if anyone is sitting with a large group of people or more than one person watching this webinar, if you could type that number into the chat box, that would be great. If it's just one person, no need to do that. But if there's 2, 3, or 15 of you, that would be helpful for us to count our numbers. And we have a question here from Alice. I found some old floppy disks, the 3.5 inch ones, while going through some boxes. Can I figure out what is on there? The label says water Y period E period 2004.
So, I mean, my educated guess would be that they're somehow related to water records for the year end of 2004, and depending on what was happening in 2004, you may have an interest in it. So, for example, if you were doing a lot of water pipe, but I mean, if you think it's just billing, then I mean, that's probably way past its retention period at this point. So I mean, if things are well labeled, you might be able to make that determination. Otherwise, you may want to consider seeing if you can get your hands on a computer that has the old disk drive on it so you can get a better look at what's in those files. And this is why it's really important when you're dealing with your electronic records to well label the media that they're on, but also to well label the files so you can understand what they are without having to open up the file themselves, which may not be the most helpful for you right this second in terms of figuring that out. But I would try to figure out what they are via context before I go hunting for a machine that will open those up. There are a lot of companies that will do that, but they will charge you a fee.
I don't see any additional questions. I did just send out the contact information as well for state agencies as well as local governments. If you click on those links, that will take you to the pages that were just the information that was in the earlier slide that Arthur showed with contact information. Have a comment here from Dawn about her old MU1. She says she's kept it because sometimes it's a little bit more detailed for documents and it's a good reference to have.
Yeah, no, totally. But just make sure that you're following the retention in the new schedule because sometimes they were updated and or there are new items in the new schedule. For example, we consolidated 4 schedules together and there are items that might not necessarily been in your schedule to begin with that you now have access to.
Okay. See if there's any other nice comment from Debbie about our presentation. Thank you. We appreciate it. Let's see. Jamie asks a question. When you have a records mess that was handed to you, how do you know where to start, but also keep up with all of your other job duties?
It's a challenge. It really is because records management is never the only job that we do, right? Um, First is figuring out the scope of the problem and figuring out how bad it is and what really needs to be done. Generally, when you have a records mess, you're going to want to start with an inventory. And whether that is something that you do yourself with your staff or whether you hire a consultant to do is going to depend on your resources and budget, honestly. But once you have that inventory where you know what you have and you know where everything is, then you can start making decisions as to, okay, I can get rid of some of these things, or I need to consolidate these record storage areas because for some reason we have the same records in 3 different rooms, or I want to start digitizing things, and this is a good collection of records to start with because they're well organized and used frequently. So the inventory really is the foundation for everything else that you are going to do. It's also going to allow you to identify the stuff that you can toss. I would reach out to your records advisory person, whether it's, because I'm not clear if you're a local government person or a state agency person, but reach out to us at the State Archives and we can help give you advice to get started and maybe some tips on where you want to go.
And with that, it looks like we've come to the end of our time here. And any last words, Arthur or Sarah?
I believe in you. You are awesome.
Yep.
You can do this.
Great. Well, thanks, everybody.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.